Alrighty, so welcome back, Bio30S. We left off on the last recording or the last set of notes with the principal organ systems of the body. So we talked about all the important parts of the actual body themselves, and now we're going to move on to the actual organ systems. This is what we're going to be studying in the course. We're not going to go through every single one of these, but the ones that we do study, we're going to try to understand them a little bit better. So let's take a look at what some of these are and how they work. Um, Remember, the human body has a whole bunch of different organs, and when they are working together, we call those organ systems. There's going to be 11 of the major ones that we work with in the body. There are more than 11 organ systems, but the major ones, those are the ones that we're more interested in for the course. So we're going to start off with the integumentary system first, and this is our first line of defense. So things like your skin and the structures that make it, all your nails, your hair, the sweat, the oil glands, all the stuff on the outside of your body, the stuff that's making sure that things outside stay outside and don't get into your body, that's your integumentary system. So it stops things like pathogens and chemicals to get to the body. Remember, if there is a virus that wants to get into your body, that's the best place for the virus to be. It has to get through your skin. And there's that saying about having thick skin and all. Your skin protects your body from those things actually getting inside. Now, we have a couple of ways that the infections or the viruses or bacteria can get in. So, obviously, your mouth is probably the most common or the most obvious one. If you don't wash your hands, you're putting that pathogen directly into your body. So, that's why we got to wash our hands and be careful with what we put into our mouths, because once something's inside, it's it's free, like it's free game or fair game. I don't know what the saying is, but the bacteria gets to do whatever it wants in that situation. A couple of other orifices you got to watch out for. Depends on what the virus or the infection or pathogen is. It could get in through your eyes, but that's a little bit less common, or in through your nose, through your airways is also a possibility. We do also have two other orifices. Anus is another option, but it's very unlikely for something to go in through the back door. We have two sphincters as well to keep things from actually getting in. But a third option is through sexual contact. Then you can bypass the integumentary system, and that's another way for pathogens to get inside. So, if you ever heard of STDs or STIs, that's where this is coming from. You're getting past the actual first line of defense. Now, our integumentary system has a whole bunch of other features as well. One of them is that it helps us eliminate waste. So, when our body is done with certain products, we can get rid of them either through secretion. So whenever we're sweating, for example, we let out some of the excess water and salts that way. Our skin will also release certain other molecules, things like carbon dioxide, will slowly ooze out. Not enough to see actual bubbles forming when we go underwater or something like that, but it gets rid of some of those extra waste products. It also helps us synthesize certain molecules, things like vitamin D. It just sits dormant in our bodies until you have that sunlight to actually work on that vitamin D. So that comes from your skin itself, and then it gets other stimuli as well. It tells us what the temperature is outside, or what the pressure is outside, or if there's any pain that is coming to our body. This is your first line of defense. So it's got all those receptors in there, and they help us react before those whatever they are, whatever those stimuli are, actually get into the body. Now, if you get past the integumentary system, we have another system in our body that holds everything together, and that is called our skeletal system. And that is, in fact, our skeleton. So, our skeletal system is going to give our body support. It's also going to give it some protection as well. So, it's a bony structure. Ours is inside of our body. That allows the stuff around our skeleton to grow. That's why we can get larger and larger. Some organisms actually have their skeleton on the outside of their body. They call that an exoskeleton. Insects are an example of that. It's really good protection. It's literally armor, but ours is on the inside, oddly enough. So insects are well protected by a hard, crunchy shell. That is their skeletal system. But they can't grow any bigger because they have that skeleton that's keeping them withheld to that size. We have the benefit of growing large because our skeleton is more for structural support, things on the inside. So our skull is an example of a part of the skeletal system. That's at the very top. It's a really thick bone that's going to protect your brain. We've also got a rib cage that covers your thoracic cavity up at the top. That's going to cover some of your other vital organs, things like your heart and your lungs. So it's not perfect protection. There are gaps there, but it still does offer significant structural protection. We've also got some other parts of protection all throughout the body, depending on where your major organ systems are. So, like your reproductive organs are protected by a couple of innominates, which ends up being your pelvic bone. You've also got other structural supports in your spine, which is part of your central nervous system. You've got vertebral column fragments that are covering that. The skin, the body's covering, we call that the integumentary system. That has a skin and things like hair and nails, as we're aware of. But it's going to also help protect the body, the internal parts from getting like that extra damage, that infection piece or the drying out portion. If we go a little bit further on, we can attach some muscles onto the skeleton to allow the skeleton to actually move. So the muscular system has all of the skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscles in the body. The skeletal muscles are going to move different parts of the body because they're going to typically be attached to bone, sometimes to cartilage. And whenever you contract a muscle, that's when you are going to move that muscle itself. So if I want to lift my hands over my head, there's got to be some muscle somewhere on my body. So if I'm lifting my hands over my head, there's muscles in my shoulders that are going to be pulling my arms upwards, and that's going to allow the muscles that usually pull my arms down to relax. So you always have these back and forth muscles that are usually working on your body. For any of you that work out, you also have to be careful when you're working out these muscles that you don't want to necessarily work out opposing muscle structures, because then you're going to have these counteracting weakened muscles. For instance, if you work out your chest, you probably don't want to work out your back the exact same day. Otherwise, your body's going to want to bend forward and backwards all at the same time. Or if you work out your biceps, your upper arm on the front side, on the anterior side, great, you might get big biceps, but you don't want to work out your triceps on the same day because your triceps are going to help straighten your arms out. So if your arms are tired, they're going to always curl in one direction or another. But if both parts are tired, your arms kind of have a hard time figuring out what to do, getting that rest piece involved. The muscular system's also making us move, making us adapt to our environment. So depending on where you are, different muscles will be larger depending on what you do. Obviously, if you're swimming more often, you're going to have larger back muscles. If you are more of a runner, you live in the hills, your legs might be a little bit stronger. If you have to lift heavy objects all the time, then your upper body will probably be stronger. It really depends on what you do. That's going to change depending on where you live and how your body has to adapt to that. It could even be your work, which we talked more about that in our last set of lessons. We also have to watch out for facial expressions, all of the different motions that we can change on our body. If you're going to change anything by moving something, it's typically going to be a muscle that is doing that. So people that are very expressive, there are certain languages, for example, where you rely on the changing facial features to actually read what a person is saying, as opposed to the sounds that we make. In English, we say sounds and we listen and we hear sounds, and that's what's going to cause us to interpret, say, what one person means versus what another person means. But if you go to other parts of the world, it's less so about the sounds we make and more so about the shape of our mouth. So people from those parts of the world will have a much more developed muscular system in that part of their body. Also got what are called smooth muscles. These are found inside of the internal organs. So things like your stomach, your intestines, the uterus, any blood vessels. That's so that things can move along in those vessels or inside of those organs. They have to move too, so that the stuff inside your body can keep moving. You don't typically work those ones out in the same way. Like you don't go to the gym to work out your digestive muscles. You eat certain foods to work out your digestive muscles, and so on and so forth. We've also got some very special muscle that's surrounding your heart called cardiac muscle, and that's for the movement of your heart itself, so that your heart can pump blood in the way that it necessarily needs to do so. We'll talk more about that whole system when we get into the circulatory system, because it's a totally different way of running a certain muscular group. And lastly, there's this branching that you'll find when we get to that that allows your heart to contract in different ways. We're going to see that with smooth muscle in some of your organ systems also. For example, when we talk about urinary and excretory systems, when we talk about the bladder, which has a whole bunch of smooth muscle, depending on what direction the smooth muscle is shaped, that's going to help us determine what direction our bladder can actually stretch. And that's probably a very useful tool for humans to have, because if we didn't, the moment we had fluids in our bladder, we would just have to pass them on, release them. So it's good that we have those stretch muscles in our bladders. Before we get there, though, we are going to talk about the heart. And when we talk about the heart, we're going to jump into the circulatory system, which is a fraction of the cardiovascular system. So we're going to break it into the circulatory system, but we can call it the cardiovascular as well if you wanted to. This is typically your heart, which is going to pump all the blood throughout. That's your moving network. It's like a river system in your body. You have different vessels, some that take blood away from your heart, some that take blood back to your heart. You're going to get oxygen and you're going to get carbon dioxide out from your various cells. CO2 ends up being a waste product of cellular respiration, so that's why we got to get it out. But you have to get it to a place where you can get it out. So anywhere where you can get rid of waste is useful. If you want to get rid of a lot of gas in one go, you'd bring it back to the lungs. And that would be the respiratory system. But in order to get it there, you need a circulatory system to move it from place to place. We're talking about immune systems, so how our body protects itself from various situations. That's where the lymphatic system comes into play. This is one of the more difficult ones to wrap your head around because it's like the circulatory system, almost identical to it, but with a couple of very significant changes. So it uses the lymph system, lymph nodes and lymph vessels, and they go through alongside most of the circulatory system as well. And this contains a whole bunch of various lymph products that are going to help us fight off things like infections or keep things running smoothly. They're also going to help keep our blood volume constant because we want to have the same amount of blood at all times. The lymph nodes, they will have specialized cells. We call them white blood cells. We have specialized white blood cells called lymphocytes, and they're going to help digest any infections or pathogens that get into our body. The immune system is also going to protect the body from foreign substances and infectious microbes. So when things do get in, our immune system will either be ready for it or it will learn about it, and then we'll be able to take it on. That learning piece is when we talk about vaccines, but we'll get into that in a little bit more detail when we get there. A couple of products that you'll find from the immune system. We mentioned white blood cells already, but we've also got things like the lymphocytes and a couple of other specialized cells. We call those specialized cells antibodies, but again, that's something that makes a lot more sense when we actually jump into the system itself. So you can prepare yourselves for that. It is a pretty detailed and dense topic. All this stuff is transported throughout the body in the bloodstream or in what are called lymphatic vessels or lymph vessels, and they go in conjunction with the bloodstream. And then, probably the most exciting or the one that most people like to learn about, this is the nervous system. This is the electrical system that we have in our body. It is controlled with a whole bunch of nerves that go all throughout the body. They branch out either from the brain, which we call cranial nerves, or they branch out throughout the body from spinal nerves. And they go pretty much everywhere else in your body. If there is a signal that your body can receive, it's going to send out an electrical impulse to your spine, which will either relay that information to your brain, or eventually it will, or your spine will have a couple of interneural networks that will cause some sort of reaction for you. The brain itself receives information and it allows you to perceive various senses, which can be a good thing. It can also be an interesting thing because sometimes your brain doesn't have enough information. So it will take a guess and you won't realize that your brain is guessing. It's playing tricks on you because you don't have any other way of perceiving things. So your brain sometimes takes guesses and it makes you feel as if you know the answer and it makes you experience certain things, but those things don't actually necessarily always exist. An example of that is if a person is talking and you're reading what they're talking at the same time. So right now, if I'm reading notes or if I'm speaking out the notes that I'm reading on the slides and you're reading the notes at the same time, there's a possibility that I might cough halfway through saying a word, but you'll still understand the word even though I coughed because your brain fills in that gap. Even though you didn't hear me say it, your brain decides to put my voice into your brain as I'm saying that word. Even though I coughed and didn't actually say it, you'll still hear it. So your brain can fill in the gap sometimes. That's one example of something your brain isn't or your body's not actually experiencing, but your brain fills in the gaps and it helps you out. Later on, we're going to see what happens when your brain fills in the gaps, but it doesn't help you out. It makes things worse or it changes your perception altogether. So that's going to be fun when we look at that. We also have this internal information that your body sends signals to your brain for. So, when you have like a pain in your chest or something, that will send a signal to your brain to let you know that there's a pain in your chest, and it might give you a clue as to how to deal with that pain. So if you have heartburn, for example, that's not necessarily your nervous system, that's your digestive system, but your brain is getting a signal there's something going on there. And if you have experience or know what to do about that, you can actually take an antacid and calm and soothe that pain out so that you don't have to worry about it so much. The one that is also quite exciting to get into, but one of the harder topics, so we'll see how we're doing for time, is the endocrine system. And this one is fairly similar for both males and females, but there's a couple of reproductive glands that change the way that this behaves on the system. So if the nervous system is our electrical system, the endocrine is going to be our chemical system. We have so many of these organs in our body that are going to produce these chemicals, and we just call those chemicals hormones. Those hormones are slower acting because they're chemicals instead of electrical impulses, but they're going to cause other changes elsewhere in the body. Um, Sometimes that can be used to benefit us. Sometimes that can be, used against us, or it might be ill-timed and it causes a couple of issues. So we call the glands that we're interested in the endocrine glands, and as a group, they are the endocrine system. The endocrine glands, they allow hormones to get into our blood. Our blood is going to transport those hormones to wherever they need to go. It's not like they have a memory or anything like that. It's just a chemical, but the chemical will respond to a certain part of the body. So when the blood gets it to where it needs to get to, then you'll have that reaction actually happening. The hormones will regulate a whole bunch of different activities, things like ingestion, metabolism, growth, reproduction, your heart rate, water balance, um, temperate control, anxiety, stress, pleasure, all sorts of these different things. Your endocrine system has a role to play in that. So it's a good one to know about. And if there's any way that you can control how some parts of your endocrine system are going to function, it's probably worthwhile, especially for those positive things that you can experience, things like pleasure, growth. Those are things that you want to live through. So if you have any control over that, it's useful to have. It's also useful to know that if you don't have control over certain parts, your endocrine system is going to work regardless, and it might compound itself onto things. So if you don't have any way of controlling your pleasure, that could eventually turn into things like anxiety, stress, or anger. So um, something that you really want to have a good grasp over. Some of the organs that we'll find, they have multiple purposes. They might be also part of different organ systems. The pancreas, for example, it has hormones that regulate the amount of sugar that's in your blood. Um, but there's also non-endocrinic tissues in the pancreas, so it helps in digestion as well. So your pancreas has a role in a couple of different organ systems there. So you want to look after these organs especially. I mean, you want to look after all your organs, but you want to look after these organs especially because you don't want any damage going to multiple organ systems if you can help it. Then, if we go back to the cardiovascular, another big conjunction to that is the respiratory system. The respiratory system is how we exchange gases. So, our environment is full of gases. Some of those are things that we need. Remember, gases are also types of chemicals. We need them in our bodies sometimes. So, our respiratory system is going to help us get those gases and then dissolve them into our bloodstream and then get them to places. The main one is oxygen. We want to get that oxygen in our body. We've also got a waste product of carbon dioxide, and we have a lot of it that we want to get rid of. So we should be able to do that using our gas exchange system. Air typically goes into the system up at the front where your mouth and your nose is. There's a couple of different pieces there that we use to our advantage. For example, we have a set of these strings, kind of like a guitar. We call that just the larynx or the voice box, and that allows us to have a voice. So that's the sounds that you hear are just the vibrations of a whole bunch of strings in our throat. And then that air goes down through the trachea and then it splits off into your lungs, through the bronchi into your lungs. And that's where the gas exchange is going to happen. So you have two lungs. You can't necessarily survive as well with just the one. You need to have both of them working fairly well together. Now you can still exist with just one lung, but typically you need both of them working because you have so much oxygen and carbon dioxide that you need to regulate throughout your body. The organ system that we're going to start with is going to be the digestive system, and we're going to bring nutrition into this also so that I can explain different things that your digestive system might actually appreciate more than what you're typically used to. So this is where you ingest food, and then you break it down to smaller chemical units. The foods you eat, depending on what is in them, will have lots of difficult and complex chemical units in them. But if we break them down into their elementary structures, that's something that our body can actually use. So there's some of those structures that our body can use very well, and there's some of those structures our body has no idea what to do or how to deal with. For the ones that your body can take, we're going to crush them down, we're going to break them down, we're going to chemically destroy them, we're going to mechanically destroy them, and then we're going to send them to a place called your small intestine to absorb all those pieces that we actually want. We're going to use a lot of water to do that. And then later on, we're going to try to suck up as much of that water as we can in your large intestine, but whatever is left over, we're just going to eject out of the body. So that's when you will eliminate any waste products through your anus or through your rectum and then through your anus. So Your digestive system is essentially one giant long tube from your mouth to your anus, and all the food goes through the whole system, and only the important pieces are broken down and taken up. We've also got another organ, it's an accessory organ, which isn't directly involved with the digestive system, but it has a passive role to play, and that's your liver. It's the largest organ that we have in our body, and it's got a whole bunch of different functions that it's going to do and help us out with. So one of the things that does is it discharges this chemical called bile. Bile is going to help us emulsify fat, right? Because if we were to have a water-based system, the fat doesn't really work in that system. That's why you can't pour oil down your sink. But we have this bile in our bodies that comes from our liver. It's going to emulsify the fat so that we can put it into our water and then actually have some use for it, either as a digestive property or something to help us dissolve other food products that might be easier to eat when we can dissolve them. Continuing on, we look at the urinary and excretory systems. The excretory system is the way that your body is going to get rid of different wastes. We have kidneys in our bodies, which are like amazing filters. They'll remove some of the nitrogen-containing wastes, often the toxic ones, the ones that could cause lots of harm to our body if they were stuck inside. So kidneys will filter all that out. They'll help regulate our water in our body, and then it will store all of that waste product in our bladder. Just for a short while. We don't want to keep stuff in our bladder for too long because that can cause some issues. But then through our bladder, once we have an opportunity to relieve ourselves, we can get rid of that waste product. This should be a regularly used filter system. So if you're peeing on a regular basis and your pee is fairly clear color, it means you're doing a pretty good job. You're keeping your system fairly well fed and flowing. If you stop doing that as much, then you start to get more concentrated urine. There's more issues that could arise from that. Worst of which is something called kidney stones. If you've never had kidney stones before, I've been very fortunate so far not to experience that, but from what I've been told, it's like the most painful thing that a person can ever go through. So you probably don't want to get kidney stones if you can help it. Keep drinking fluids in that case. There's also this whole balance about how they look after our blood, both our pH, so our acidity, and they also help with the water balance in our blood. So that's a pretty nice thing to have. And then one of the organ systems we're not going to look at in this course, which is the reproductive system. That's because you guys have to look at it in health and phys ed anyways, so you learn about it in a totally separate course. But it is another major system of the human body. It's different for both the males and the females. One, you got different organs, but two, you've also got different glands and gamete-producing organs there as well. So you have ovaries for the female, you have testes for the male. And this is a strange one because the reproductive system isn't necessarily for just the health of the human body. It's actually for the proliferation of your genetics, which you've probably figured out. You probably understand that already. But there are some parts of the reproductive system, when they are engaged, are actually beneficial for the human body. So those are also things to just keep in mind. These systems are going to help the species rather than the individual as a whole. In the female, the ovaries are going to produce egg cells. These are the cells that you can actually see without a microscope. They kind of look like grains of sand. They have a limited amount of how many that they can produce. Males, on the other hand, can produce sperm cells, and they can produce millions of sperm cells at a time. So there's no real issue about how many sperm cells a male can have. Typically, the strongest, or usually one of the strongest sperm, will beat out the other sperm to get to the egg to fertilize it, and then that will be housed in the uterus to form a fetus and then eventually a baby. And how these guys all work together, all these organ systems, and how they regulate themselves and work in conjunction with each other. The whole goal is to maintain homeostasis, and that's the theme of our course. So all these systems are going to work together. They're going to work together to maintain homeostasis. If you are in good health, we can say that you're probably in a good state of homeostasis. With that being said, that homeostasis is going to change from time to time, but your body should be able to reflect on that. It should be able to react and change. And if your body is able to do that, then we can say you're in a good state of homeostasis. Those changes could be things that happen inside your body. They can be changes that happen outside your body. They can be things that you have control over. They have things that you have no control over. But as long as you're able to regulate that and keep yourself healthy, then you're in a good state of homeostasis. Keep this in mind because this is the major theme of the course. Watch for all the little things that we are going to cover where we really challenge the idea, like what can we do to get out of homeostasis? And when that happens, what does the body do to get back in? what is that whole balance piece, and how does our how does our body manage that? When homeostasis is not met, your body is way too fluctuating. It is way too out of whack, essentially. And again, we've mentioned it before, biology is very binary. If you can't maintain homeostasis, you typically end up dying. So we're going to watch out for these different pieces where we can really play around with that and how our body does its best to whip us back into homeostasis, but just be aware of the things that can pull us away if we're not too careful about it. Our body's going to use a whole bunch of these different mechanisms to try stay stable. It's not always going to work. It's kind of like a thermostat. You might get some negative or positive feedback to help us stay within those ranges. So now we know a little bit about homeostasis. I think this is probably a good stopping point for the current time. We'll continue on and look at these different feedback loops, both negative and positive feedback loops, and we'll look a little bit at the anatomical terms as well. And that should wrap up this portion of the introduction to the course, essentially, the human body and homeostasis. So we'll test that out. We'll see what kind of things that we can do, really simple things to pull us out of homeostasis and see how well we understand what those changes are. We'll do a couple of little activities to try and understand that as well. But if there are any questions, as always, feel free to let me know, and we'll try to tackle them together from there. Anyways, thank you. If you manage to stick through and read through or watch through all these notes, I appreciate it. Either way, hopefully you're having a good day, and we will catch each other at the next class.